The story begins at a House Ethics Committee hearing in Washington, D.C., with one senator and one congresswoman facing each other under the harsh light of national scrutiny. The senator is John Kennedy of Louisiana, a Republican known for his slow drawl and deceptively simple questioning style. The congresswoman is Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, a high-profile progressive lawmaker whose words and actions have generated intense debate far beyond her district. From the first seconds, it is clear that this is not a routine procedural exchange, but a carefully staged confrontation over trust, power, and the real-world consequences of political rhetoric. Senator John Kennedy does not open with ideology, party labels, or sweeping accusations. Instead, he frames his role as that of a plain-spoken outsider, repeatedly referring to himself as a simple country lawyer, a rhetorical move designed to lower defenses while raising expectations. Across from him, Representative Ilhan Omar sits composed and confident, visibly accustomed to hostile questioning and media attention. The contrast between Kennedy's folksy delivery and Omar's polished demeanor establishes the central tension of the hearing, a clash between populist moral framing and institutional political experience. The hearing room itself becomes part of the narrative. Cameras are everywhere, committee members fill every seat, and the gallery is packed well beyond capacity. This detail matters because Kennedy explicitly reminds Omar that the audience is not limited to those in the room. Millions of Americans are watching, and in his telling, they will remember not just her answers, but her silences. From the outset, Kennedy signals that this exchange is about public judgment as much as official oversight, a theme that will shape everything that follows. Kennedy's first line of questioning centers on campaign finances, an area where legal compliance and ethical perception often diverge. He asks Ilhan Omar whether she improperly benefited from campaign donations, framing the issue not as a technical violation, but as a matter of personal integrity. Omar responds in the language of compliance, emphasizing disclosure rules and federal guidelines. This exchange immediately reveals the broader conflict driving the narrative. Kennedy is speaking to voters' sense of fairness, while Omar is speaking to the formal standards of governance. Rather than debating statutes, Kennedy introduces a specific individual to anchor the discussion. He names Betty Henderson, a retired nurse from Minnesota who donated a small amount of money to Omar's campaign. By naming her, locating her, and describing her life circumstances, Kennedy transforms an abstract funding question into a human story. This is a deliberate rhetorical move. The focus shifts from whether campaign reports were filed correctly to whether a public servant honored the trust placed in her by an ordinary supporter. Ilhan Omar's reaction at this stage is restrained but telling. She does not deny that the expenditures occurred, nor does she concede wrongdoing. Instead, she emphasizes legality and procedure, which, while factually relevant, fails to address the emotional core of Kennedy's argument. The opening does not yet declare Omar guilty of corruption, but it strongly suggests a disconnect between her public messaging about economic justice and the optics of her campaign's financial decisions. That suggestion, not a legal conclusion, is what drives the tension. What makes this opening effective as political commentary is that it does not rush to verdict. Kennedy repeatedly pauses, allowing silence to amplify the weight of his questions. Omar's composure is noted carefully, because the narrative wants the audience to interpret any later hesitation as meaningful rather than incidental. Every gesture, every pause, every unfinished sentence is framed as part of a larger moral evaluation being conducted not by the committee, but by the public. Crucially, the opening establishes that John Kennedy is not acting alone as a partisan attacker, but as a proxy for broader public skepticism. He positions his questions as ones people at home would ask if given the chance. This framing allows the critique of Ilhan Omar to be presented as a matter of accountability rather than ideology. Whether one agrees with Kennedy or not, the structure invites viewers to consider how public trust is built and how easily it can be eroded. Ilhan Omar, for her part, is portrayed neither as a villain nor as a victim in this opening, but as a politician caught between two standards of judgment. On one side are the formal rules of campaign finance and ethics law, which she insists she followed. On the other side is a moral expectation articulated by Kennedy, in which perception, symbolism, and donor intent carry equal, if not greater, weight. The opening makes clear that the hearing will revolve around this tension rather than a narrow legal determination. By explicitly naming Senator John Kennedy and Representative Ilhan Omar and placing them in direct confrontation, the opening sets the foundation for a broader examination of political responsibility. It signals that the story ahead will not be about abstract policy debates, but about how real people interpret the actions and words of those in power. The audience is prepared for a series of testimonies and arguments that will test whether Ilhan Omar's public image aligns with the lived experiences of those invoked in her rhetoric. This opening, therefore, serves a clear purpose. It frames the hearing as a symbolic trial of credibility, establishes John Kennedy as the interrogator and Ilhan Omar as the subject, and defines the central question that will guide the narrative forward. When elected officials claim to fight for ordinary people, how should they be judged when those people feel betrayed? Everything that follows is positioned as an attempt to answer that question. One name, one story, and one uncomfortable silence at a time. After establishing the confrontation between Senator John Kennedy and Representative Ilhan Omar, the hearing moves from framing to execution, and the strategy becomes clear. Kennedy is not attempting to overwhelm Omar with dense legal theory or partisan rhetoric. Instead, he organizes his questioning around a sequence of human stories, each chosen to reflect a different dimension of public trust. The pattern is consistent: a short question, a pause, a named individual, and then a moral comparison that places Omar's words or decisions alongside the lived experience of someone outside the political class. The first segment, centered on campaign finance, does not accuse Ilhan Omar of a specific crime in legal terms. Kennedy is careful, almost conspicuously so, to avoid asserting that laws were broken. What he emphasizes instead is the gap between technical compliance and ethical expectation. By naming Betty Henderson and describing her as a retired nurse living on a fixed income, Kennedy reframes campaign donations as acts of faith rather than transactions. The implication is not that Omar violated a statute, but that she may have violated an unwritten contract between representative and supporter. Omar's responses in this section are notable for what they prioritize. She returns repeatedly to disclosure rules, reporting requirements, and federal guidelines, all of which are valid within the formal structure of campaign oversight. Yet Kennedy's questioning deliberately sidesteps those defenses. He is speaking less to regulators and more to voters, who may not care whether a line item was properly filed if the result feels wrong to them. This tension illustrates a recurring problem in modern politics. Legality often provides insulation from punishment, but it does not necessarily protect against reputational damage. The narrative weight of this segment lies in perception. Kennedy's pauses and repetitions allow the audience to sit with the image of a small donor and a large payment, even if the actual mechanics are more complex. Omar's composure, while intact, begins to look rigid rather than confident. The hearing at this stage becomes a lesson in how ethical debates are often won or lost in the court of public opinion long before any formal conclusion is reached. The second major segment shifts focus from money to immigration. introducing Muhammad Hassan by name and by history. Here, Kennedy contrasts Omar's advocacy for immigration reform with Hassan's experience navigating the legal system. Hassan is presented not as a statistic, but as a person who followed every rule and paid every fee, only to wait more than a decade to reunite with his family. The purpose of this testimony is not to claim that Omar personally controlled immigration timelines, but to highlight a perceived inconsistency between rhetoric and reality. In neutral analytical terms, this segment explores the frustration many legal immigrants feel when listening to political debates that emphasize compassion but rarely address bureaucratic inertia. Kennedy uses Hassan's story to question whether political leaders fully account for the costs imposed by slow systems on those who comply with the law. Omar's position that the system is broken and needs reform is not inherently contradicted by Hassan's experience, but the narrative frames it as insufficient. The audience is invited to see Hassan's patience as evidence of moral authority, while Omar's faster path becomes a point of comparison rather than accusation. What makes this exchange powerful is not the suggestion of illegality, but the emotional resonance of lost time. Kennedy repeatedly emphasizes years missed, birthdays unseen, and relationships strained by distance. Omar's inability or unwillingness to engage directly with Hassan's pain is portrayed as a failure of empathy rather than policy. This distinction matters for YouTube-safe commentary because it keeps the critique focused on leadership and communication rather than personal wrongdoing. The third segment moves into the most sensitive territory: language, identity, and the consequences of political speech. By introducing Sarah Goldstein, Kennedy shifts the hearing from structural issues to social fallout. Goldstein's account of harassment following Omar's remarks about Jewish Americans is framed as an unintended but foreseeable consequence of charged rhetoric. Kennedy does not argue that Omar intended harm, but he presses the idea that public figures bear responsibility for how their words are interpreted and acted upon. From an analytical standpoint, this section examines the long-standing tension between criticism of political influence and the risk of reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Omar's defense, that her comments were aimed at policy and lobbying rather than individuals, reflects a common position among politicians who engage in sharp critiques. Kennedy's counter-argument is that audiences do not always make such distinctions, and that historical context amplifies the impact of certain phrases regardless of intent. Goldstein's testimony serves to personalize this debate. By describing her role as a teacher and the fear she experienced, the narrative underscores how abstract language can translate into concrete harm. Omar's emotional response in this segment is more visible, and the hearing begins to resemble a moral reckoning rather than a policy discussion. Importantly, the analysis does not require the audience to conclude that Omar is malicious, only that she may have underestimated the reach and effect of her platform. The fourth segment escalates further by invoking national trauma, specifically the September 11th attacks, through the testimony of Captain Thomas Brady. Here, Kennedy challenges Omar's phrasing by juxtaposing it with the lived reality of families who lost loved ones. This portion of the narrative operates almost entirely on symbolism. The phrase attributed to Omar is treated not as a policy statement, but as a shorthand that fails to honor the gravity of the event. In neutral terms, this exchange highlights the difficulty of discussing civil liberties and security without appearing to minimize suffering. Omar's explanation that she was addressing broader issues of rights and backlash is plausible within academic and activist circles, yet Kennedy frames it as tone-deaf in a public forum. Brady's testimony, focused on names and personal loss, shifts the debate from abstract analysis to emotional memory. The hearing, at this point, becomes a referendum on whether precision in language matters as much as intention. The final major segment addresses economic rhetoric and its perceived impact on small business owners, with James Morrison as the focal point. Kennedy contrasts Omar's critiques of capitalism and wealth inequality with Morrison's experience as a struggling business owner. The story is constructed to suggest that political language can legitimize hostility toward certain groups, even if that outcome was not intended. Morrison's losses are framed as collateral damage in a broader ideological battle. From an analytical perspective, this segment explores how populist economic narratives can oversimplify complex realities. Omar's advocacy for systemic change is juxtaposed with Morrison's individual hardship, creating a moral dilemma rather than a factual dispute. The symbolism of the key placed on the table serves as a visual representation of trust lost, not proof of direct causation. Kennedy's point is not that Omar ordered or endorsed vandalism, but that rhetoric has consequences, and leaders must reckon with them. As the main body unfolds, a consistent pattern emerges. Senator John Kennedy uses named individuals to embody broader critiques of Ilhan Omar's political style and messaging. Each testimony reinforces the central claim that leadership is judged not only by intent or legality, but by outcome and perception. Omar's defenses, while often reasonable within institutional norms, appear increasingly disconnected from the emotional reality presented by the witnesses. By the end of this section of the hearing, the narrative has transformed Ilhan Omar from a powerful lawmaker into a symbol of perceived elite detachment. Whether or not that portrayal is fair, in a strict factual sense, it is undeniably effective as political storytelling. The main body does not conclude with a legal finding or formal sanction, but with a cumulative sense that something fundamental has been lost: trust, credibility, and moral authority. As the sequence of testimonies continues to accumulate, what becomes increasingly clear is that the hearing is operating on two parallel tracks at once. On the surface, it remains an ethics inquiry with defined roles, formal language, and procedural boundaries. Beneath that surface, however, it functions as a referendum on Ilhan Omar's political identity, using Senator John Kennedy's questioning to test whether her public image can withstand sustained moral scrutiny. The distinction between those two tracks matters, because the narrative power of the hearing does not come from legal finality, but from emotional saturation. By this point, Kennedy has established a rhythm that the audience understands intuitively. He introduces a name, gives just enough context to humanize that person, and then places Ilhan Omar's words or decisions alongside that individual's experience without explicitly declaring a causal chain. This technique allows viewers to draw their own conclusions while feeling as though they arrived at them independently. It is a subtle but effective form of persuasion, and it relies on repetition as much as substance. Ilhan Omar's position becomes more precarious not because she lacks answers, but because the format does not reward the kinds of answers she is prepared to give. Her responses are rooted in policy explanations, structural critiques, and references to broader systems. Kennedy's questions, by contrast, are relentlessly personal, focused on names, faces, and moments of pain. The mismatch creates the impression that Omar is speaking past the people she claims to represent, even when her policy positions are defensible in theory. This dynamic is especially evident as the hearing revisits earlier themes from different angles. Campaign finance, immigration, speech, national trauma, and economic rhetoric are not treated as separate issues, but as interconnected expressions of leadership style. Kennedy's underlying argument is that Ilhan Omar consistently prioritizes ideological framing over practical impact, and that this pattern produces unintended but foreseeable harm. The narrative does not require the audience to accept every claim as factual. It only asks them to accept that the pattern feels plausible. At this stage, the room itself becomes a character in the story. Reactions from the gallery, shifts in posture, and moments of silence are described with as much care as spoken words. The audience inside the room mirrors the audience at home, responding emotionally even when procedural rules prevent direct participation. Kennedy's occasional pauses allow those reactions to surface, reinforcing the sense that the hearing is less about extracting information and more about revealing sentiment. Ilhan Omar's emotional responses also evolve as the main body progresses. Early on, she appears controlled and analytical, confident in her ability to contextualize criticism. As more witnesses speak, her demeanor changes subtly but noticeably. Her pauses grow longer, her tone becomes strained, and her reliance on prepared language increases. From a neutral analytical standpoint, this shift can be interpreted in multiple ways. It may reflect genuine emotional impact, mounting pressure, or simple fatigue under prolonged scrutiny. The narrative, however, frames it as erosion, the gradual breakdown of a carefully maintained public persona. What is striking is that Kennedy rarely presses for extended explanations. He does not cross-examine witnesses aggressively, nor does he force Omar into technical debates. Instead, he allows testimony to stand largely on its own, trusting that the juxtaposition will do the work for him. This restraint gives the impression of fairness, even as the cumulative effect becomes overwhelming. It is a reminder that in political storytelling, tone often matters as much as content. As the hearing approaches its later stages, the focus shifts from individual incidents to broader implications. Kennedy's language increasingly emphasizes patterns, consequences, and responsibility. He speaks less about what Ilhan Omar intended and more about what happened afterward, a move that aligns with a common voter instinct to judge leaders by results rather than motives. Omar's attempts to reassert intent, context, and systemic critique sound increasingly defensive within this framework, even if they remain logically consistent. The inclusion of witnesses from different backgrounds serves another purpose as well. It insulates the narrative from accusations of narrow targeting by suggesting that dissatisfaction cuts across demographics. The retired nurse, the immigrant father, the Jewish teacher, the firefighter's family, and the small business owner represent different segments of society, all presented as having felt harmed or disregarded, whether or not each connection withstands rigorous scrutiny. The breadth of representation strengthens the story's emotional appeal. From a broader political analysis perspective, this approach reflects a shift toward personalized accountability in an era of fragmented trust. Voters increasingly respond to stories rather than statistics, and to perceived authenticity rather than ideological alignment. Kennedy's questioning style taps directly into this shift, while Omar's responses reflect a more traditional reliance on policy discourse. The hearing becomes a collision between those two modes of communication. As the main body nears its conclusion, the cumulative effect of the testimonies produces a sense of inevitability. The audience is conditioned to expect that each new segment will reinforce the same theme, and that expectation itself becomes part of the narrative momentum. By now, the hearing no longer feels like an inquiry into discrete issues, but like an extended argument that Ilhan Omar's political approach has consistently failed to account for its downstream effects. Kennedy's final exchanges in the main body do not introduce entirely new accusations so much as consolidate existing ones. He revisits earlier themes with sharper language, emphasizing disparity between rhetoric and lived experience. His questions become shorter, more pointed, as though the groundwork has already been laid and little remains to be said. Omar's responses, when they come, are brief and careful, signaling an awareness that further elaboration may only deepen the impression of distance. At this point, the hearing has achieved what it set out to do from a narrative standpoint. It has reframed Ilhan Omar not simply as a controversial figure, but as a focal point for broader anxieties about representation, privilege, and accountability. The story does not end with a legal ruling or formal sanction, but with a shift in perception, which in modern politics can be far more consequential. As the main body draws to a close, attention begins to move beyond the room itself. The implication is that what has unfolded will not remain contained within the hearing. The presence of cameras, the emotional testimony, and the deliberate pacing all suggest an audience far larger than those physically present. The groundwork is laid for public reaction, media amplification, and political fallout, even though those outcomes have not yet been fully explored. This transition matters because it signals a shift from confrontation to consequence. Up to this point, the focus has been on what was said, who said it, and how it was received in the moment. What comes next will address how such moments reverberate beyond the immediate setting, shaping narratives, careers, and public trust. The hearing, as portrayed here, is not the end of the story, but the catalyst. With the central arguments established and the emotional stakes clearly defined, the narrative is now positioned to move into its final phase. The question is no longer whether Ilhan Omar can defend her positions within the room, but how the accumulated weight of the hearing will be interpreted outside it. That shift marks the natural transition point toward a conclusion focused on impact, aftermath, and what this episode suggests about accountability in contemporary American politics. When the hearing finally recedes from immediate view, what remains is not a transcript or a checklist of findings, but an afterimage shaped by tone, sequence, and emotion. Senator John Kennedy's questioning of Representative Ilhan Omar, as framed in this narrative, becomes a case study in how modern political accountability is constructed less through formal adjudication and more through public interpretation. The exchange illustrates a reality that many elected officials understand instinctively but rarely confront directly. In an era of continuous media exposure, the most consequential judgments are often rendered outside the bounds of law, in the minds of voters who weigh stories against slogans and outcomes against intent. The central lesson of this episode is not that one side won and the other lost in a conventional sense, but that credibility is cumulative and fragile. Kennedy's method works because it aligns with a broader public expectation that leaders should be able to explain in plain terms how their actions connect to the lives they invoke. Ilhan Omar's difficulty, as portrayed here, is not rooted in a single decision or phrase, but in a perceived pattern where institutional explanations collide with personal consequences. The hearing's power comes from repetition, not revelation, and from the steady accumulation of doubt, rather than a single decisive blow. From a neutral analytical perspective, it is important to recognize that the narrative does not prove definitive causation between Omar's conduct and every harm described. Instead, it operates on plausibility and moral resonance. Each witness embodies a concern that already exists within segments of the electorate. Suspicion about campaign finance practices, frustration with immigration bureaucracy, anxiety over rising anti-Semitism, reverence for national trauma, and fear that political rhetoric can inflame social divisions. By placing those concerns in sequence and attaching names and faces to them, the story transforms abstract debate into felt experience. This transformation is both its strength and its risk. On one hand, it gives voice to individuals who often feel unheard in policy discussions dominated by experts and institutions. On the other, it can compress complexity into a binary frame where nuance struggles to survive. Kennedy's questions are effective precisely because they demand simple answers to complicated realities. And while that simplicity resonates emotionally, it does not always capture the full scope of governance. The conclusion of this narrative must therefore grapple with the tension between emotional truth and analytical completeness. Ilhan Omar's portrayal in the aftermath reflects this tension vividly. She is neither absolved nor conclusively condemned by formal authority, yet her standing is visibly altered by the process. The narrative suggests that in contemporary politics, reputational damage does not require a guilty verdict. It requires a convincing story that aligns with existing skepticism. Omar's reliance on procedural defenses, while valid within institutional norms, appears insufficient when weighed against personal testimony that evokes sacrifice and loss. This imbalance highlights a broader challenge for policymakers who operate within complex systems but must communicate their impact to audiences seeking moral clarity. Equally significant is the role of Senator John Kennedy as an archetype rather than merely an individual. His success in this narrative stems from his ability to present himself as a conduit rather than a protagonist. By repeatedly positioning ordinary citizens at the center of the exchange, he minimizes his own ideological footprint and amplifies the sense that he is channeling public sentiment. Whether this posture reflects genuine humility or strategic calculation is ultimately beside the point. Its effectiveness lies in how it reassigns authority from institutions to individuals whose stories carry emotional weight. The hearing also underscores the evolving function of congressional oversight in the digital age. Traditionally, such proceedings serve to gather information, establish records, and recommend action within a defined legal framework. In this narrative, oversight becomes performative, designed as much for viral dissemination as for institutional review. The presence of cameras, the careful pacing, and the emphasis on moments of silence all point to an awareness that the real audience extends far beyond the committee room. Accountability in this context is mediated through clips, headlines, and social sharing, each distilling complex exchanges into digestible moral judgments. This raises difficult questions about fairness and proportionality. When political consequences are driven by perception rather than adjudication, the line between scrutiny and spectacle can blur. Leaders may be judged harshly for missteps that resonate emotionally even if they fall within legal bounds, while systemic issues that lack compelling narratives remain unaddressed. The conclusion of this story invites reflection on whether such dynamics strengthen democracy by empowering citizens or weaken it by incentivizing performative confrontation over substantive reform. The individuals highlighted throughout the hearing play a crucial role in this reflection. Their stories are compelling not because they are unique, but because they are recognizable. Many viewers can see themselves, or someone they know, in the retired nurse, the immigrant parent, the teacher facing hostility, the family of a first responder, or the struggling business owner. These figures serve as mirrors, reflecting broader anxieties back to the audience. The narrative's effectiveness depends on that recognition, on the sense that politics is not an abstract game, but a force that shapes everyday life in tangible ways. At the same time, the conclusion must acknowledge the limits of such storytelling. Individual experiences, however powerful, cannot fully represent the complexity of national policy debates. Immigration systems involve trade-offs that affect millions in different ways. Campaign finance laws balance transparency with political participation. Speech in a pluralistic society inevitably carries multiple interpretations. Economic rhetoric can inspire reform while also provoking backlash. Reducing these issues to a single moral axis risks obscuring the difficult choices inherent in governance. What this episode ultimately reveals is a gap between how politicians often speak and how audiences increasingly listen. Voters are less inclined to accept abstract assurances or procedural explanations when confronted with stories of personal loss. They seek acknowledgement, empathy, and a sense that leaders understand the human dimension of their decisions. In this narrative, Ilhan Omar's failure is framed not as ideological extremism, but as communicative distance, an inability or unwillingness to bridge that gap convincingly under pressure. The broader implication is that political survival now depends as much on narrative fluency as on policy expertise. Leaders must be prepared not only to defend their positions, but to contextualize them in ways that resonate emotionally without sacrificing accuracy. Those who cannot do so risk being defined by their critics, who may be more adept at shaping perception. Kennedy's approach exemplifies this dynamic, demonstrating how strategic questioning can reframe debates by foregrounding stories that align with public sentiment. As the story concludes, the emphasis shifts from individual accountability to collective responsibility. The hearing is portrayed as a moment when citizens are encouraged to engage more actively with the actions of those they elect. Whether viewers interpret the outcome as justice served or spectacle indulged, the underlying message is that democracy is participatory, not passive. Accountability, in this telling, is not solely the domain of committees or courts, but of an informed and attentive public willing to question, challenge, and reassess its leaders. The conclusion does not call for retribution or exclusion, but for awareness. It suggests that political discourse carries weight beyond intent, and that leaders must account for how their words and decisions are received by those outside the halls of power. It also cautions audiences to recognize the persuasive techniques at work, to distinguish between emotional resonance and empirical certainty. In doing so, it invites a more reflective form of engagement, one that values both empathy and critical thinking. In the end, the story closes not with a definitive verdict, but with an open-ended challenge. It asks whether future leaders will learn from this episode, adjusting their language and priorities to better align with the lived experiences they reference. It asks whether voters will continue to demand accountability grounded in human impact rather than partisan loyalty. And it asks whether political institutions can adapt to an environment where perception often outruns procedure. The narrative's final note is therefore neither triumph nor tragedy, but tension. It leaves unresolved the balance between fairness and force, between nuance and clarity, between policy and story. That tension is not a flaw, but a reflection of contemporary politics itself, where accountability is contested, narratives compete, and trust must be earned repeatedly rather than assumed. The hearing, as portrayed here, becomes a reminder that in a democracy shaped by constant scrutiny, the simplest questions can carry the heaviest consequences, and that answering them requires more than compliance. It requires connection.